In a quiet lakeside town, where the waters mirror the tranquility of everyday life, a burly fisherman named Jake casts his line each morning. Jake's calm demeanor belies a past far more intense than catching fish. You see, Jake wasn't always just a fisherman. Once he served as a sharpshooter in the army, trained to hit targets miles away with precision. But life had its own plans for Jake, leading him to this serene lakeside existence. One day, a group of local troublemakers took notice of Jake's size and assumed he was an easy target for their antics. They mocked his weight and made jokes about his simple lifestyle, unaware of the steel within him. Little did they know, Jake's military training had honed not only his aim, but also his patience. He calmly endured their taunts, never revealing his past. As tensions simmered, the bullies escalated their harassment, unaware that Jake's silence masked a steely resolve. What happens next will surprise everyone, revealing that beneath the calm waters of Jake's daily life lies a depth they never expected. The bullies, a group of young men who thought they owned the town, seemed to take special joy in making Jake their target. They'd show up at the dock where he fished, laughing loudly and making cruel remarks about his weight or the size of his catches. They'd even go as far as tipping over his bait bucket or throwing stones into the water to scare away the fish. Jake remained calm, his weathered hands steady as he tied his fishing line. His quiet restraint only seemed to egg them on, fueling their belief that he was too timid to fight back. What they didn't know was that Jake wasn't ignoring them out of fear. His years of military service had taught him to measure every response carefully. Every insult they hurled was filed away, every shove noted. Beneath his calm exterior, Jake's mind was sharp, analyzing, waiting. The bullies had no idea they were playing a dangerous game with someone who had once survived the harshest battles. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower over the lake, the bullies decided to push things further. They cornered Jake near the old boathouse, smirking as they blocked his path. "Hey, big guy," one of them sneered, "why don't you share some of that bait with us? Or are you saving it all for yourself?" Another snatched at his fishing rod, waving it around as the others laughed. Jake stayed silent, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he hadn't heard them. But inside, memories of his army days stirred. The missions that demanded focus, the discipline drilled into him. He wasn't afraid of these boys, but he knew acting rashly could make things worse. Meanwhile, some of the locals watched from a distance. An elderly shopkeeper shook his head, muttering, "They don't know who they're messing with." Rumors about Jake's past had circulated quietly among the older residents, but none of the bullies had ever paid attention. Just as one of them shoved Jake's shoulder, trying to provoke a reaction, a sudden movement caught everyone's attention. Jake slowly stepped forward, retrieving his rod with a grip so steady it made them falter. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that silenced the jeers. The air grew thick with tension as they hesitated, unsure if they had crossed a line they couldn't see. The group of bullies exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading as Jake's calm demeanor began to feel unnerving. There was something in his eyes now, a quiet confidence that made them question everything they'd assumed about him. But pride pushed them forward. One of them, the self-proclaimed leader, sneered, "What are you gonna do? Fish us to death?" The others chuckled nervously, trying to mask their growing discomfort. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he calmly set his rod aside and stepped toward the lake, his movements slow and deliberate. The group instinctively backed up, caught off guard by his composure. Jake reached down and picked up a stone, tossing it lightly in his hand before skipping it across the water with effortless precision. The sound of the stone cutting through the calm lake echoed in the silence. "You see that?" Jake said, his voice low and steady. "You don't always need force to make an impact." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and the bullies didn't quite know how to respond. But the leader, desperate to save face, scoffed and stepped closer, his voice louder now to mask his unease. "Is that supposed to scare us, old man?" Jake's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, except to someone trained to notice. The tension was thick, like the stillness before a storm. The bullies felt it too, even if they didn't understand why. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. A truck pulled up by the dock, and out stepped a middle-aged man in a sheriff's uniform. It was Deputy Harris, someone who'd grown up in town and knew Jake well. The bullies froze, unsure if they were about to get into trouble, but Harris didn't address them right away. Instead, he walked straight over to Jake, giving him a respectful nod. "Everything all right here, Jake?" Harris asked, his tone calm but laced with understanding. Jake didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the group in front of him. Finally, he nodded. "For now," he said evenly, his voice carrying an unspoken warning. The bullies exchanged nervous glances, sensing something they hadn't before, an unspoken connection between Jake and the deputy. Harris turned to the group, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You boys ought to know when you're out of your depth," he said, his voice firm. "Jake is not the kind of man you want to push." One of them, emboldened by the group's numbers, scoffed. "Why's that? He's some kind of hero or something." Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Jake, as if seeking permission. Jake gave a barely perceptible nod. "Jake served this country," Harris finally said, his voice steady. "Saved a lot of lives, too. Let's just say he's got skills you wouldn't understand." The leader of the group laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. But the others weren't so sure anymore. The weight of Harris's words hung over them, planting doubt and fear. Still, the leader pushed on. "So what? That was a long time ago. He's just some old fisherman now." Jake stepped forward then, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a predator might stalk its prey. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet intensity. "I'm just a fisherman now, but don't think for a second I've forgotten how to handle trouble." The bullies shifted uneasily, the atmosphere crackling with tension. For the first time, they seemed to realize they might have underestimated the man standing before them. The leader of the bullies tried to hold his ground, his bravado flickering like a weak flame in the face of Jake's quiet resolve. "We're not scared of you," he blurted, though his voice wavered. The others didn't echo his words this time. They could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken line they'd already crossed. Jake took another step forward, stopping just inches away from the leader. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You don't have to be scared of me," he said quietly, "but you should respect what you don't understand." The leader tried to reply, but before he could, Jake pointed toward the edge of the dock. "You left your shoe untied," he said calmly. Confused, the young man glanced down, and in that split second, Jake's hand moved like lightning. With a swift motion, he reached into the leader's jacket and pulled out a small pocket knife the boy had been hiding. Jake held it up, the blade glinting in the sunlight, before calmly folding it and handing it to Deputy Harris. "Guess you won't be needing this," Jake said. The group stood frozen, their faces pale as they realized how quickly Jake had disarmed one of them without breaking a sweat. Harris stepped in then, his voice firm. "That's enough. You boys are lucky Jake's the patient kind. Now get out of here before you make this worse for yourselves." Before they parted ways, Jake picked up his fishing rod and cast his line again, as though nothing had happened. But as he sat by the water, his eyes softened, reflecting both the calm of the lake and the quiet strength of a man who knew when to fight and when to let go. As the lake returned to its quiet rhythm, Jake sat with his fishing rod, letting the calm settle back in. The encounter hadn't rattled him. had seen far worse in his lifetime, but it reminded him why he'd chosen this peaceful life by the water. The bullies would think twice before bothering him or anyone else again, and that was enough.